I want to begin with the idea that you can't be both a Democrat and a progressive. If you've been following the Force the Vote brouhaha, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There are no progressive Democrats. If progressives want to be progressives, they need to stop being Democrats. And that includes regular people like us. If you've been following this show for a while, you've heard me often compare our government system to fascism. We have no democracy, we have fascism. And one of the clearest indicators is how the United States has been treating Julian Assange. This article by Andy Greenberg is from Wired. The UK denies Julian Assange's extradition, citing suicide risk. The ruling is based not on whether the WikiLeaks founder violated the Espionage Act, but on the implications of subjecting him to the US carceral state. The caption under this photograph, this stunning photograph, says, "Julian Assange won't face a US courtroom, at least for now." Since WikiLeaks began releasing massive troves of US military and State Department secrets more than 10 years ago, Julian Assange has maintained that the American government would eventually seek to put him in a US prison. In a surprise twist, he may escape that fate, not because his organization's leaks are protected by free speech rights, but instead due to Assange's mental health and a court's ruling that subjecting him to US incarceration could increase the risk of suicide. In a London courtroom Monday morning, UK Judge Vanessa Baraitser ruled that the US cannot extradite Assange to stand trial for criminal charges of hacking, conspiracy, and violations of the Espionage Act, which the US Department of Justice first leveled against Assange in 2019. Baraitser argued in her ruling that extradition would be unacceptably oppressive due to Assange's mental state, including diagnoses of Asperger's syndrome, autism, and suicidal thoughts, and the risk that Assange would in fact kill himself if those conditions were exacerbated by the state of isolation he'd likely face in the US justice system. In her statement, Baraitser compared the special administrative measures that Espionage Act convicts often face in prisons like ADX Florence, the Colorado prison where Assange would likely be incarcerated in the US, to those in the UK's Belmarsh prison where he's been housed since his arrest. She detailed how he'd be allowed only 2 non-legal phone calls a month, denied contact with other inmates at the prison, and granted 2 hours of solo recreation time daily in a cage, as she described it. Faced with the conditions of near total isolation and without the protective factors that moderate his risk at Belmarsh, I'm satisfied that the suicide prevention procedures described by the US will not prevent Mr. Assange from finding a way to commit suicide, Judge Baraitser told the court. For these reasons, I've decided that extradition would be oppressive by reason of Mr. Assange's mental health, and I order his discharge. The U.S. government is expected immediately to appeal the ruling, a process that will likely begin in a matter of months. For now, Assange remains in custody pending a bail hearing. Nevertheless, the decision represents a brilliant and surprising win for Julian, says Naomi Colvin, the UK-Ireland program director at Blueprint for Free Speech, which has supported Assange throughout his legal case. The US will appeal, but because this swung on the medical evidence, the starting position has to be that Assange is likely to prevail at the High Court too. While the judge's decision represents a potentially life-changing victory for Assange, it does little to defend the press freedoms that many observers consider to be on trial in Assange's case. For me, dear viewers and listeners, that's the central point. It's obviously a good thing for Julian Assange. It's less obviously a good thing for freedom and justice. Until the final section of Baraitser's statement, she shot down practically every argument Assange's defense attorneys had laid out against extradition in weeks of hearings, many of which focused on how the prosecution of Assange would represent an unprecedented criminalization of journalistic activity. And that's a big fucking deal. Prosecuting Assange would set a horrible precedent. In particular, Baraitser focused on a moment in which Assange encouraged his source, then Army Private Chelsea Manning, to dig up more classified secrets for him and offered to help her crack another user's password so that she could more easily cover her tracks as she rooted around the Army's network. U.S. prosecutors have never proven or even alleged that Assange followed through on that offer or that either he or Manning ever successfully cracked a password as they discussed. Nonetheless, Bereitzer argued that incident helped show how Mr. Assange's activities went beyond the mere encouragement of a journalist. That password-cracking allegation, however, only justifies the computer fraud and abuse conspiracy charge that Assange faces, argues Trevor Timm, the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation and a witness for Assange's defense in the extradition hearings. The remaining 17 counts, which all relate instead to the Espionage Act, would represent the first time in modern history a publisher was charged under the Espionage Act for essentially journalistic activities, such as seeking classified information from sources, Timm argues. If this case went forward, it would criminalize large swaths of news gathering and publishing practices, he says. And that's why there should be riots over this. It's bad enough that they're harming Julian, but they're harming everyone in the world if they set this precedent. Despite the judge's arguments that Assange could be charged under the Espionage Act, Timm sees today's ruling as a win. It's hard to call it a complete victory for press freedom, but it's a huge sigh of relief, he says. Despite the judge's Espionage Act arguments, her decision about Assange's mental health may nonetheless prevent the U.S. from setting a precedent that someone like Assange can be prosecuted for publishing national security secrets. To create a lasting precedent, they need a conviction in U.S. court, and if this decision is held up, they won't get it, says Timm. Any decision that prevents the U.S. government from obtaining that precedent is a good thing. In the ruling, Bereitzer writes that the accounts of several psychiatrists who had seen Assange in prison in the UK swayed her decision. In her oral statement to the court, she emphasized the account of one psychiatrist, Michael Kopelman, who had testified that he observed in Assange signs of suicidal risk, including loss of sleep, loss of weight, a sense of preoccupation and helplessness as a result of threats to his life, the concealment of a razor blade as a means to self-harm, and obsessive ruminations on ways of killing himself. Kopelman wrote at one point in his testimony that Assange expressed having suicidal thoughts hundreds of times a day and that prison staff had confiscated multiple potential suicide implements from him. Bereitzer also noted a 1991 incident when Assange was hospitalized for a week after cutting his wrists and observed that he had a family history of suicide. She expressed concern that if he were put in isolation in the U.S. prison system, as Assange's defense had argued he likely would be, he would not only be driven to self-harm but would succeed due to what Kopelman described as his single-minded determination, typical of those with autism and Asperger's. I'm satisfied that Assange has the intellect and determination to circumvent suicide prevention measures, Bereitzer said. The decision in Assange's case represents the third time in recent history that an accused hacker in the UK has been protected from extradition based on mental health considerations. Laurie Love, a UK hacker associated with Anonymous, similarly escaped U.S. prosecution due in part to an Asperger's diagnosis in 2018, as did alleged hacker Gary McKinnon in 2012. America's poor treatment of prisoners, and particularly those like Assange with national security relevant cases, may lead to the failure of a major prosecution that some in the highest levels of the U.S. government have sought for nearly a decade, notes well-known cybercrime defense attorney Tor Eklund. This is me. If the United States weren't such well-known assholes when it comes to their treatment of prisoners, they might be able to better circumvent our freedoms. They should get on the ball. A UK court is saying you can't trust the US prison system to treat its inmates fairly and humanely, and that outweighs any alleged damage from Assange's release of top-secret information, says Eklund. It's not the first time a UK court has done this, and it's a damning indictment of the US prison system and its inhumanity. This one's from Al Jazeera. Julian Assange supporters outnumber his critics. Who are they? With a week until a London court announces the verdict on Assange's extradition case, we take a look at the public figures supporting him and those condemning his whistleblowing. So obviously, this was written a little over a week ago. Singer MIA and supporters of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange gather outside Westminster Magistrates Court in London, UK, January 13, 2020. The fate of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange will be decided on January 4th when the Old Bailey Court will pronounce the judgment on whether he will be extradited to the United States from the United Kingdom. But his fate actually wasn't decided because the US is going to appeal. The U.S. has charged him with hacking government computers and espionage after he obtained and published hundreds of thousands of classified documents between 2010 and 2011, including the Afghanistan and Iraq war logs. The charges could lead to an unprecedented 175 years in jail for the Australian-born publisher. He was arrested from the Ecuador embassy in London in February 2019, where he had been given asylum 7 years earlier. Recently, calls to pardon him have grown louder, including from unlikely characters such as former U.S. vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin, a Republican. In September, 160 former and current world leaders and diplomats signed a letter demanding the UK government prevent his extradition. Rights groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the American Civil Liberties Union have called for his release. Increasingly, prominent media outlets such as The Guardian are also voicing their concern about the charges leveled against the jailed publisher. You'd think media outlets would definitely be on Julian Assange's side. When you see prominent media outlets smearing Assange, you know that they're in the pocket of our oligarchy. Yet some continue to back the US's attempt to punish Assange. I think we should name names, don't you? Here are some highlights from world leaders, diplomats, academics, and celebrities. Okay, here are some names in support. Alberto Fernandez, Argentina's president. The Argentinian president, who has been described as a leftist, was one of the signatories of the September letter which described the allegations against Assange as troubling. We call on you to act in accordance with national and international law, human rights, and the rule of law by bringing an end to the ongoing extradition proceedings and granting Mr. Assange his long overdue freedom. Freedom from torture, arbitrary detention, and deprivation of liberty and political persecution, the letter said. Jeremy Corbyn, UK's ex-Labour Party leader, the former Labour Party leader and current UK MP, a veteran socialist, has said possible extradition to the US should be opposed and called for the rights of whistleblowers and journalists to be upheld for the good of us all.
And we should recall what WikiLeaks actually disclosed. Who can forget the Pentagon video footage of a missile attack in 2007 in Iraq, which killed 18 civilians and 2 Reuters journalists? It is the monumental amount of leaks such as this that lifted the veil on US-led military operation in a variety of theatres, none of which has produced a favourable outcome from the people of those countries. Julian Assange is not being pursued to protect US national security. He is being pursued because he has exposed wrongdoing by US administrations and their military forces.
That's about the size of it. Lula da Silva, the ex-Brazilian president, has consistently demanded Assange be released. In September, he wrote a column for the UK's Guardian newspaper saying Assange's possible extradition to the US would be an outrage. Linguist and political critic Noam Chomsky, one of the world's leading intellectuals, claims extraditing Assange would be catastrophic for press freedom. Assange is on trial for his journalism, for his principles, not his personality, he and writer Alice Walker said in an op-ed for the UK-based paper, The Independent. The world-renowned artist Ai Weiwei has hailed the WikiLeaks founder, asserting that Assange represents a core value of why we are free, a comment that referred to press freedom. We need a lot of protesting, and it can take any form. I'm an artist. If I cannot use my art, it's very limited. Then I'd rather just be silent, he said at a pro-Assange rally in September. Rafael Correa, the former Ecuador president, has long been a supporter of the Australian, granting him asylum in 2012 at the country's embassy in the UK. After his successor and current president, Lenin Moreno, revoked Assange's asylum, leading to his arrest by UK authorities, Correa strongly condemned the decision. Scoundrel and betrayal can be summarized in 2 words, Lenin Moreno, he said. Sarah Palin, former Republican U.S. vice presidential candidate. Earlier this month, former Republican vice presidential candidate Palin demanded Assange be pardoned. I made a mistake some years ago not supporting Julian Assange, thinking that he was a bad guy, Palin said on social media, and I've learned a lot since then. He deserves a pardon. Palin had previously been an ardent critic of Assange, who released private emails and photos of the former Alaska governor in 2008 during her election campaign.
Hey, this is Sarah Palin up in Alaska, and I am the first one to admit when I make a mistake. I admit that I made a mistake some years ago not supporting Julian Assange, thinking that he was a bad guy, that he leaked material that perhaps he shouldn't, and I've learned a lot since then. And I think Julian did the right thing, and Julian did us all a favor in America, did the world a favor by fighting for what he believed was right. And ultimately, he's been proven to be right. He deserves a pardon. He deserves all of us to understand more about what he has done in the name of real journalism. And that's getting to the bottom of issues that the public really needs to hear about and benefit from. Some years ago, I publicly spoke out against Julian, and I made a mistake. Like I say, I've learned a lot since then. I know that it's coming down to the wire and whether he's going to be pardoned or not. I want more Americans to speak out on his behalf and to understand what it is that he has done and what has been done to him as he was working on the people's behalf to allow information to get to us so that we could make up our minds about different issues, about different people. He did the right thing. I support him. And I hope that more and more people, especially as it comes down to the wire, will speak up in support of pardoning Julian. God bless him.
What she didn't say was that he is right because he is telling the U.S. what they're doing wrong. He's exposing criminal activity on the part of the United States government. In addition, we have Pamela Anderson, Roger Waters, Tulsi Gabbard, Edward Snowden, fellow whistleblower, MIA, British musician, and Daniel Ellsberg, another U.S. whistleblower. It was clear to me that these revelations, like the Pentagon Papers, have the capability of informing the public that they had seriously been misled about the nature of war, progress in war, the likelihood of it ending at all, he told the court. Now, of course, Lenin Moreno is going to be critical. Hillary Clinton is critical. Mitch McConnell is critical. Oh, Mitch. And John Bolton is critical. Former NSA advisor to U.S. President Donald Trump, Bolton had previously said that U.S. cyber warfare people should use WikiLeaks for target practice. He was an ardent supporter of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq while serving in government during the George W. Bush administration. I wanted to hear the names mentioned out loud of our most prominent consent manufacturers and narrative managers. For those of us who are concerned about how all this plays out and we don't know which side to take because we don't know which information is to be trusted, seeing who's on each side really can help. Bottom line for me is that Julian Assange is on the side of we the people. He's critical of the war machine most of all, and that puts him on the right side of history.